Grace, a young girl with a disability, lived in a quiet suburban neighborhood where she had always felt a sense of belonging. Her days were filled with simple joys: the sound of birds chirping in the morning, the laughter of children playing outside, and the occasional walk through her neighborhood, where every familiar face seemed to welcome her with kindness. It was during one of these walks, on a warm afternoon, that Grace, filled with curiosity, decided to ask about a dog that had gone missing. She had noticed a flyer on a nearby pole, its edges frayed by the wind, and as she walked by it, a thought crossed her mind. I wonder if anyone knows what happened to the dog, she thought to herself. The thought was innocent, the question simple. She had no idea that this small inquiry would set off a chain of events that would forever change her life. Grace approached Karen, the woman who lived just down the street, known for her strict adherence to neighborhood rules. Karen was an HOA officer, and while her role was to maintain order in the community, it had long been whispered that she had a particular fondness for wielding authority. In the past, she had clashed with neighbors over trivial matters, overgrown lawns, misplaced trash cans, and most recently an argument about a fence that was 1 inch too tall. Grace had never had any issues with Karen, and she had always admired the older woman's perfectly manicured lawn and her well-maintained garden. So, when Grace asked her about the missing dog, she thought it would be just another brief interaction between neighbors. But what happened next was far from what Grace had expected. Karen, whose pleasant expression had greeted Grace moments before, suddenly shifted. Her smile vanished, replaced by a scowl that seemed to appear from nowhere. "What do you want?" Karen snapped, her tone harsher than Grace had ever heard. The abruptness of the response startled Grace. She stood frozen, unsure of what had just happened. "I'm just asking about the dog," she stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. But Karen's eyes narrowed, and in an instant the woman's face twisted into something unrecognizable, a mix of anger and annoyance that seemed completely out of proportion to the question Grace had asked. "Why don't you mind your own business?" "There's nothing for you to know," Karen shot back, her voice rising. The harshness in her words sent a chill down Grace's spine. She had never seen Karen this angry, and the sudden hostility made her feel small and helpless. But Grace, determined to be polite, tried again, her voice trembling slightly. "I just wanted to know if anyone had seen the dog," she repeated, hoping that this time the conversation would settle down. But Karen wasn't having it. "You always stick your nose in where it doesn't belong," she barked, her voice now sharp and venomous. Grace stepped back, her heart racing as the situation escalated. Karen was no longer the friendly neighbor who had always waved hello. Instead, she had become a stranger, someone who, for reasons Grace couldn't understand, had chosen to lash out at her for no apparent reason. In a moment of blind rage, Karen's hand shot out, and before Grace could react, the hot coffee she had been holding in her other hand was suddenly hurled toward her. The scalding liquid hit her face and arms, and the pain was immediate, burning through her skin like a wildfire. Grace cried out, her body jerking back in shock, but it was too late. The damage had already been done. The warmth of the day was replaced by an intense, stinging heat, and she could feel the tears welling in her eyes, not from the physical pain, but from the sheer betrayal she felt. How had something so simple as asking a question about a missing dog led to this? Karen stood there, a mixture of anger and satisfaction on her face. She didn't apologize, nor did she show any remorse. Instead, she coldly dismissed Grace, as if the pain she had just inflicted meant nothing at all. "You deserved it," she said, turning away. "Maybe next time, you'll think before you speak." Grace stood there, stunned, her skin burning with the sensation of the coffee that had seared her body. The pain was unbearable, but it was nothing compared to the feeling of helplessness that flooded over her. How could Karen, someone who she had never considered a threat, have done something so cruel? She had always believed that kindness and empathy were at the heart of every neighborly relationship, but now Grace was left questioning everything she thought she knew about the world around her. In that moment, Grace realized that this wasn't just about a missing dog. It wasn't even about Karen's outburst or the burn on her skin. This was about power, control, and the horrifying realization that people, no matter how seemingly normal or pleasant, could turn on you in an instant. The innocence she once carried with her had been shattered, and in its place, a deep sense of fear and betrayal took root. And as she stood there, the weight of what had just happened settled over her. The question now wasn't just about the dog, it was about how she would ever find her way back from this dark encounter. Little did Grace know this was only the beginning. The incident with Karen was just the beginning, but it felt like the end of something much deeper for Grace. The searing pain on her skin from the coffee was a constant reminder, but it wasn't just the physical scars that haunted her, it was the emotional toll that this encounter had left behind. Karen's words, the cruel dismissal, echoed in Grace's mind as she tried to process everything that had just transpired. What was supposed to be a simple conversation had escalated into an act of violence, and Grace had no idea how to move forward from here. She was now caught in a whirlwind of confusion, shame, and frustration. At first, Grace hesitated to tell anyone about what had happened. She was embarrassed. Embarrassed not by the burn, but by the fact that someone had treated her like that for something as innocent as a simple question. She didn't know how to explain it to her parents, her friends, or even her neighbors. What would they think? What would they say about her? Would they believe her? The questions flooded her thoughts, and the fear of not being taken seriously only made the situation worse. But the pain in her arm and face became too much to ignore, and after a few hours, Grace knew she couldn't stay quiet any longer. Her mother, a kind and patient woman, was the first to see the burn. Her shock quickly turned to concern, and when she asked Grace what had happened, Grace hesitated for a moment before telling her the truth. She described the exchange with Karen, how she had simply asked about the missing dog, and how Karen's response had been so disproportionate. As Grace spoke, her mother's face shifted from concern to anger. This wasn't just about a burn, this was about the kind of cruelty that no one should ever have to endure. "I'm going to call the police," her mother said firmly. "This is assault, Grace. What she did to you is wrong, and we're not going to let her get away with it." Grace, still in shock, nodded, but a part of her was terrified. What if the authorities didn't believe her? What if Karen denied everything and turned the situation around on her? Would anyone even care? The self-doubt weighed heavily on Grace's shoulders, but her mother's resolve gave her a small sense of comfort. The next day, the police came to the house, and after taking the report, they told Grace's family that they would need to gather evidence and speak with witnesses. But as Grace learned soon enough, the investigation was far from straightforward. Karen, it seemed, was well known in the community. She had a reputation for being strict, yes, but she also had a certain level of influence. As an HOA officer, she had a hand in many of the neighborhood's decisions, and several residents admired her for the order she maintained. When the police spoke with Karen, she was calm and composed, denying everything. "I don't know what she's talking about," Karen said in her interview. "There was no hot coffee thrown at her. I don't even drink coffee that hot." The police officer, who had initially seemed sympathetic to Grace's story, now appeared less certain. "Are you sure she didn't accidentally spill it on herself?" he asked, trying to downplay the severity of the incident. Grace's heart sank. Was this really happening? Was the person who had caused her so much pain now being allowed to twist the truth and get away with it? Her mind raced with the fear that she would be left with nothing but a bad memory and an untreated wound. It felt like the system was already failing her, and with each passing moment, the world Karen had built around herself seemed to be closing in on Grace. As the investigation dragged on, the community's response was lukewarm at best. Some neighbors expressed their concern for Grace, but others remained silent or outright sided with Karen. "Oh, Karen's always been a little hot-headed," one neighbor said, "but she wouldn't hurt anyone on purpose." The dismissive attitude toward Grace's suffering made her feel more isolated than ever. The very people she had once seen as her neighbors were now divided, and it seemed like Grace was the one left to pick up the pieces. The tension in the neighborhood was palpable. Grace's family became the subject of whispered conversations, and as the days passed, Grace began to feel like a pariah. Her walk down the street, once something she had done with ease, now felt like a battleground. Every time she passed Karen's house, the bitterness of what had happened would come rushing back. The coffee stains on her skin were a constant reminder of her vulnerability, but it was the emotional scars that were beginning to fester. At the same time, Karen continued to walk with her head held high, seemingly unaffected by the incident. It was as if she knew something Grace didn't. Maybe it was her position in the HOA, or maybe it was the way she had manipulated the situation to her advantage. Either way, Grace's frustration began to boil over. She couldn't just sit back and let Karen win. Something had to be done. Grace spent sleepless nights replaying the incident in her mind, trying to figure out how she could fight back. Her initial shock was slowly being replaced by determination. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about standing up for herself, for anyone who had been pushed around by someone like Karen. The fear was still there, but it was now accompanied by a growing resolve. She wasn't going to let Karen get away with what she had done. The fight for justice was just beginning, and Grace was ready to take on the fight no matter what it took. But even as she prepared to take action, a chilling thought crossed her mind. Karen wasn't just going to let this go. If Grace wanted to win, she would have to be prepared for whatever came next. As the days passed after the police report, Grace found herself in a constant state of emotional turmoil. The burn from the hot coffee had begun to heal physically, but the emotional scar left by Karen's cruelty seemed much harder to erase. Every time she looked in the mirror, she saw the remnants of the attack, the angry red marks that hadn't yet faded completely, and it was a painful reminder of what had happened. But what cut deeper than the physical pain was the feeling of helplessness that consumed her. Grace had always believed in the goodness of people, in fairness, and in justice. But now, in the aftermath of Karen's attack, she felt like those beliefs had been shattered. Her family, too, was shaken. They were supportive, yes, but even they began to doubt how far they could push this issue. With Karen denying everything and the community divided, the idea of winning this battle seemed impossible. The support they had expected from their neighbors was sparse at best. Some, like Grace's mother, remained firm in their belief that justice must be served, but others seemed indifferent or willing to ignore the seriousness of the situation. Grace's father, a quiet man who had always taught her to stand up for what was right, became more withdrawn as the days wore on. He didn't speak much about the case, and when he did, it was with a tone of uncertainty, as if he had lost faith in the system. Grace could feel it. Her family was tired. They had invested so much energy into fighting for justice, but as each day passed, it felt as though the fight was slipping away from them. The police weren't providing any new leads, and the legal process, which was supposed to bring Karen to account, was dragging on with no end in sight. But it wasn't just her family that was showing signs of wear. Grace, too, was losing her grip on the strength she had once felt. The anxiety of waiting for a resolution, coupled with the emotional weight of the whole situation, took its toll. The scars on her skin were a constant reminder of her vulnerability. She didn't feel safe in her own neighborhood anymore. Every time she stepped outside, the world felt different, darker, colder, as if she had lost something she couldn't get back. In the beginning, Grace had been so sure that this was something she could overcome. She thought that standing up for herself, telling the truth, and fighting for justice would be enough. But now, after weeks of silence from the authorities and growing frustration from her family, she began to question whether it was worth it. Was she even strong enough to take on someone like Karen, who seemed so powerful and untouchable? The isolation was perhaps the hardest part. Grace had always been a social person, someone who loved being around others. But now, the same people she had once shared her life with seemed like strangers. She no longer felt comfortable in the neighborhood, in the park where she used to play, or even in her own home. The situation had alienated her from everyone, and the feeling of being alone, of not having anyone truly understand her pain, was unbearable. Her friends, who had once supported her, had begun to distance themselves. Some didn't know what to say, while others simply didn't want to get involved. It was as if they were too afraid of the conflict or too uninterested in the drama that had consumed Grace's life. The few who did reach out offered empty words of sympathy, but didn't fully comprehend the gravity of what had happened. It wasn't just a burn on her skin, it was the violation of her trust, the abuse of her vulnerability, and the cruelty of someone she had once respected. In these quiet moments of reflection, Grace's mind turned to the people who had once stood by her. She thought of her family, how they had always been there to support her through every trial. But now, as they all struggled under the weight of the situation, she felt an overwhelming guilt. They were fighting for her, but she was beginning to feel like a burden. The pain wasn't just physical, it was mental and emotional too. And the more she thought about it, the more she realized how much the situation had affected her. It wasn't just the burn on her skin. It was the anger, the helplessness, the fear of not being believed, and the grief of losing a sense of safety and security in her own home. But amid this despair, something inside Grace began to stir. Deep within her, beneath the layers of fear and frustration, a quiet determination began to grow. She couldn't let this be the end. She couldn't let Karen win, couldn't let herself be crushed under the weight of the situation. Even though the world around her seemed to be falling apart, Grace found herself clinging to one thought. She wasn't going to give up. The emotional toll had been great, but she knew that if she stayed silent now, if she let this injustice go unanswered, she would forever regret it. This wasn't just about her. It was about anyone who had ever been bullied, belittled, or made to feel small. Grace wasn't going to let Karen take away her voice. She was going to keep fighting, even if it meant facing her fears, even if it meant standing alone. But Grace also knew that she couldn't do it alone. She needed support. She needed the truth to be heard. And though it seemed like the world was turning against her, there was one thing she still had: her resolve. And that Grace was beginning to understand was far stronger than anything Karen could ever throw at her. The battle wasn't over yet, and Grace wasn't ready to surrender, not to the pain, and certainly not to Karen. Grace's resolve hardened with each passing day. The emotional pain from the coffee burn remained, a daily reminder of what Karen had done, but Grace was no longer consumed by fear or self-doubt. She was determined. The injustice that had been done to her wasn't just a personal betrayal, it was a violation that needed to be addressed, not only for her sake, but for anyone else who might find themselves in a similar situation. After her family's initial attempt to seek legal recourse, Grace knew that they couldn't just sit back and wait for the authorities to act. The system, as she had learned, moved slowly, and Karen, with her connections in the community, had a way of deflecting any real consequences. Grace realized that she had to take matters into her own hands, but she needed help. She reached out to a local attorney, someone her mother had heard about who specialized in personal injury and civil rights cases. Grace's first meeting with the lawyer was one of the most empowering moments of her life. The lawyer listened intently as Grace recounted every detail of the incident, from the casual greeting to Karen's explosive response and the moment the hot coffee splashed onto her skin. When Grace finished, the lawyer was silent for a moment, studying her. "You've been through a lot," the lawyer finally said, "but this is far from over. You've got a strong case, Grace. What Karen did was assault, and it's not something we can ignore." For the first time since the attack, Grace felt a sense of validation. She wasn't crazy for thinking that Karen's actions were wrong. She wasn't overreacting or making a big deal out of nothing. This was real, and it was time for someone to stand up and say enough was enough. The legal battle, however, wasn't without its challenges. Karen's influence in the community became immediately apparent. The HOA board, which Karen had been a part of for years, rallied behind her, some even questioning Grace's version of events. They painted Karen as a misunderstood person, someone who had lost her temper momentarily, but ultimately had good intentions. The more Grace's lawyer dug into the case, the more she began to realize how much Karen had woven herself into the fabric of the neighborhood. It wasn't just about a personal attack, it was about a power dynamic that ran deep within the community. The investigation soon revealed that Karen had been involved in multiple other incidents where her temper had gotten the best of her. Neighbors had long whispered about her aggressiveness, but no one had ever taken it seriously enough to confront her. Grace's case was beginning to shine a light on a pattern of behavior that had gone unchecked for far too long. But as the tension mounted, Grace also felt the pressure building around her. The more she fought for justice, the more isolated she felt. The community, which had once felt like home, now felt like an enemy. Every glance from a neighbor, every comment from someone who knew Karen, felt like an accusation. Grace had become a symbol of confrontation, of standing up to power, and that made her an easy target for ridicule. People didn't want to get involved, didn't want to choose sides. In the midst of this turmoil, Grace's parents became her rock. They reminded her daily that the fight was bigger than just one woman. It wasn't just about Karen's actions, it was about standing up against injustice, against anyone who thought they could use their power to harm others. "This isn't just for you, Grace," her mother said one evening, holding her hand as they sat together in the living room. "This is for every person who's ever been bullied or pushed around. You're giving them a voice, too." Grace couldn't ignore that. She realized that, although the battle was exhausting, she wasn't fighting alone. There were others who felt powerless in the face of people like Karen, and if she backed down now, it would send the message that such behavior was acceptable. And Grace knew, deep in her heart, that it wasn't. The next phase of the legal proceedings was the hardest yet. It was time for Grace to face Karen in court. The thought of it made Grace's stomach twist in knots. She had spent so many sleepless nights imagining the confrontation, imagining Karen's lies and the way her cool, collected demeanor would likely try to discredit her. Karen had a way of looking calm, of seeming as though she was in control while she manipulated the situation. Grace wasn't sure if she was ready for that, but she had to be. There was no turning back. The courtroom was tense, and Grace could feel the weight of the moment on her shoulders as she took the stand. Her heart raced, and she could feel her palms sweating, but she pushed through the fear. This was her moment. She was telling the truth, and no one, not even Karen, could take that away from her. Karen, on the other hand, was as composed as ever. She denied everything, of course. She claimed that the coffee had been spilled by accident and that she had never intended to harm Grace. But the more she spoke, the more Grace saw the cracks in her story. Karen's excuses were flimsy, and her confidence began to falter under the pressure of the facts. Grace's lawyers skillfully pressed her, pulling out contradictions and highlighting her history of aggression. The courtroom began to see Karen for what she truly was, a bully who had used her position of power to manipulate others. As the trial progressed, the tide began to turn in Grace's favor. The evidence was stacking up, and the community, though still divided, was beginning to see the truth. Karen's actions couldn't be brushed aside any longer. There was no way she could hide behind her position or her charm. The more Grace fought, the more she realized that justice wasn't just about winning the case. It was about finding her strength, about standing tall in the face of adversity, and knowing that no matter the outcome, she had done the right thing. The fight for justice was far from over, but in that moment, Grace knew she had already won something far more important: her voice, her dignity, and the unwavering support of those who truly cared about her. The courtroom had grown tense as the trial reached its climax. Grace stood in the witness stand, her body shaking slightly, but her resolve as strong as ever. The last few days had been a blur of testimony, arguments, and the slow, steady unraveling of Karen's carefully crafted facade. Karen, who had once seemed untouchable, was now facing the consequences of her actions. The very woman who had used her position in the community to intimidate others to control her neighbors was now being exposed for what she truly was: a manipulative, aggressive person who had inflicted harm on a vulnerable girl simply because she asked a question. Grace had never imagined herself in a situation like this. She had always thought of herself as a quiet observer of the world, someone who tried to keep her head down and avoid conflict. But everything had changed the moment Karen had thrown that hot coffee at her. Now, standing in that courtroom, she was no longer the girl who had been burned. She was someone who had found her strength, her voice, and the courage to stand up for herself. As the defense continued to cross-examine her, Grace could feel the pressure building. Karen's lawyer, a slick, well-spoken man, tried to discredit her every chance he got. He twisted her words, tried to paint her as an unreliable witness, and even questioned her memory of the events. But Grace, though rattled, didn't back down. She answered each question with unwavering clarity, refusing to let Karen's lawyer manipulate the truth. Karen sat at the defense table, her expression one of quiet defiance. The calmness on her face only made Grace angrier. This woman who had assaulted her, who had tried to strip away her dignity, was still acting as if she was in control. But Grace was determined not to let Karen get away with it. With every question, with every objection, she could feel the weight of the truth pushing back against Karen's lies. Grace wasn't just fighting for justice anymore. She was fighting for her own peace, for the ability to move forward without fear, without shame. And then it happened. The moment that Grace had been waiting for, when Karen finally lost her composure. In the middle of the final cross-examination, Karen's lawyer asked her one question too many. He tried to twist the facts again, but this time, Karen's response was different. Her voice, which had once been so controlled, cracked under the pressure. "Look," Karen snapped, her voice rising in frustration. "I was just trying to protect my property. That girl had no business asking about the dog. She was just being intrusive." The outburst sent a ripple through the courtroom. Karen's calm facade crumbled, revealing the true extent of her anger and entitlement. It was clear to everyone in the room that this was not just about a missing dog or a question gone wrong. This was about Karen's deep-seated need to control those around her, to assert power over anyone she deemed lesser. And now, in front of everyone, she was showing the very same rage that she had unleashed on Grace that fateful day. For the first time, Karen seemed vulnerable. The audience could see through her carefully constructed persona, and it made her look small. The calm, collected woman who had so easily brushed off others' concerns was now visibly rattled. And it was in that moment, as the courtroom took in her every word, that Grace realized just how far she had come. She wasn't just standing up for herself anymore. She was shattering Karen's carefully crafted lie. Grace's lawyer saw the opening, and with the audience's attention now fully on Karen, he pressed forward. He pointed out how Karen's actions had been completely disproportionate to the situation, how her need for control had led her to harm an innocent person. The prosecutor, who had been relatively quiet up until that point, now moved in for the final blow. "Ms. Karen, you claim that Grace was intrusive, but did that warrant throwing scalding coffee at her? Did it justify physically harming someone because you didn't like a question? And what does your history of aggression say about your ability to be a responsible member of this community?" The prosecutor asked, his tone firm and deliberate. Karen was silent for a long moment, her eyes darting between the prosecutor and the judge. The weight of her own words seemed to sink in. The courtroom, which had been filled with tension, was now silent except for the judge's gavel. "Your Honor," the prosecutor continued, "this is not just a case of a simple misunderstanding. This is about a woman who, instead of resolving a situation with kindness and empathy, chose violence. This is about someone who has abused her position of power to harm another person. And for that, Ms. Karen should be held accountable." The words echoed in the room, and Grace could feel a sense of validation wash over her. She had endured the emotional strain, the constant questioning, and the doubt, but now the truth was coming to light. The fight had been long, and it had been difficult, but she was starting to see the end of it. In that moment, Grace knew that this wasn't just about winning the case, it was about showing everyone who had ever doubted her that she had the strength to stand up for herself. It was about proving to Karen and to the world that no one should ever be allowed to get away with cruelty just because they have power. As the final arguments were made and the jury deliberated, Grace sat quietly, knowing that whatever the outcome, she had already won. The story of her courage, of her resilience, would be told, and Karen, for all her attempts to hide behind her position, would no longer be the one who controlled the narrative. The truth was out, and it was far stronger than any lie Karen had told. As the gavel came down, the room erupted in applause. For the first time, Grace felt the weight of the last few weeks lift from her shoulders. She wasn't just a victim anymore. She was a survivor. The days following the trial were a whirlwind of emotions for Grace. The verdict had come down in her favor. Karen was found guilty of assault, and the community had to face the uncomfortable truth that someone in their midst had used their power to harm another. But while the legal battle was over, Grace knew that the Real journey was only just beginning. The immediate aftermath of the trial was overwhelming. The small neighborhood, once a place of familiarity, felt different now. Grace's family, still reeling from the emotional roller coaster of the trial, found themselves uncertain of where to go from here. They had won, yes, but at what cost? The community had been divided, and the relationships they once shared with their neighbors had become strained. Some rallied behind Grace, offering their support and apologies, while others, especially those who had been close to Karen, remained silent or even hostile. Grace, however, felt a deep sense of relief. She had gone through hell, mentally, emotionally, and physically, but she had come out the other side. The scar on her skin was fading, but the experience had left an indelible mark on her. She had stood up for herself when no one else would, and in doing so, she had not only held Karen accountable, but also empowered herself. Yet, as the dust settled and Grace began to rebuild her life, she found herself struggling with the question of what the future would look like. The victory in court had been cathartic, but it had also exposed the deep fractures within her community. Grace couldn't pretend that everything would simply go back to normal. She couldn't unsee the way the people around her had turned their backs when she needed them most. The betrayal of those who had failed to stand with her weighed heavily on her. And despite the legal victory, there was still a sense of loss. Grace's family, too, had been affected by the ordeal. They had stood by her, but they had paid a price as well. Her parents, exhausted by the constant emotional strain, found themselves reflecting on the cost of justice. It hadn't been just about the legal proceedings. It had been about the toll it took on their family, on their peace of mind, and on their relationships with the community. Grace saw the quiet sadness in her parents' eyes, and it broke her heart to think that they, too, had suffered because of Karen's actions. But despite the lingering sadness, Grace knew that her family's support had been the anchor that kept her going. They were the ones who had pushed her to take action, to stand tall and fight for what was right, even when it seemed like the world was against her. It was because of them that Grace was able to walk into that courtroom with her head held high. And now, as she reflected on the journey, she realized just how much stronger she had become. She had fought for justice, not just for herself, but for anyone who had ever been treated unfairly, anyone who had been silenced by fear or by the weight of power. It was this realization that drove Grace to take the next step. She didn't want to be remembered as the girl who had been burned by a cup of coffee. She didn't want her story to be about the cruelty she had endured, but about the strength she had found in herself. And so, Grace decided to speak out. She started by sharing her story with local news outlets, with organizations that advocated for victims of violence and abuse, and with anyone who would listen. She became an advocate for victims of assault, for those who had been marginalized or ignored by the system. Her story was a testament to the power of resilience, of standing up for what was right, even when it seemed impossible. As time passed, Grace became more involved in her community again. She knew things couldn't go back to the way they were before the incident, but she also knew that change was possible. Through her own courage and determination, she began to inspire others to find their voices as well. People started to see her not just as a victim, but as a force for change, and that in many ways was the greatest victory of all. Karen, on the other hand, was no longer the powerful figure she once was. The verdict in court had shattered her reputation, and she was ostracized by many of her former friends and neighbors. The community had seen through her facade, and while she may have tried to hold on to her position in the HOA, it was clear that her influence had been irreparably damaged. In the end, Karen's actions had cost her everything: her reputation, her power, and her place in the community. But while Grace's victory was bittersweet, it was also a reminder of the importance of standing up for what is right. She had fought for justice, not just for herself, but for the greater good. In doing so, she had taken back her life, her dignity, and her voice. And now, as she looked forward to the future, she was no longer afraid of the unknown. She had learned that no matter how hard the fight, no matter how steep the climb, justice was worth fighting for. The final message of Grace's story was one of empowerment. She had started as a victim, but she had ended as a hero in her own right. She had taken control of her narrative and shown the world that no one, no matter how powerful, was above the law. And with that, Grace knew that she was ready to move forward. With the strength she had found within herself, she was ready to face whatever came next, confident in the knowledge that she had already won the most important battle of all, the battle for her own peace. If Grace's story has resonated with you, if you believe in the power of standing up for what's right, be sure to subscribe to HOA Denied Access for more powerful stories of justice, resilience, and triumph. Let's continue to speak out, let's continue to fight for change, and let's make sure that no one is ever silenced again.